Hello YouTube. The Khajiit, intelligent cat-like humanoids native to Tamriel's Elsewhere province. They are one of the most interesting aspects of the Elder Scrolls universe, and as a race, they're one of the major things that set the Elder Scrolls universe apart from other fantasy universes. That said, over the past 8 years of covering the Elder Scrolls lore on this channel, I've often talked about the Khajiit in many different videos. And today I present you almost all the lore I covered on the Khajiit in the past, all in this one long, definitive lore collection on the Khajiit. So, if you always wanted to know how the Khajiiti language works, what their music is like, or how they bury their dead, well, it's all going to be in this long video with timestamp chapters so that you can skip to things that you particularly want to know or skip things that you don't really care about. Now, we're going to start by talking about the different types of Khajiit that we can find across Tamriel after the intro. So, the Khajiit. As many discovered when the Elder Scrolls Online launched their Elsewhere expansions, there are many different types of Khajiit, different breeds if you will. The Khajiit themselves called these different types Furstocks instead of breeds. You've got Khajiit of all sizes and shapes, from the small, almost house cat-like Alfiq to the gigantic Sentia rats, and even some almost human-like Furstock, which we haven't seen since the Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall. The reason that there's such a great variety in Furstock is that the Khajiiti procreation is a bit more complicated than the procreation of other races. But in addition to male and female Khajiits doing the nasties in their order to procreate offspring, there's a third factor in Khajiiti procreation, the moons, Messer and Secunda. The moons are central to Khajiiti society, as the moons and in which phases the moons are in during the Khajiit's birth are the factors which determine the Furstock of the newborn Khajiit. Two Alfiq, the size of two house cats, can procreate and the mother can give birth to a large Pamar if the moons are in the correct phases. And in addition to that, we know that all types of Khajiit can procreate with all types of Khajiit and thus give any type of offspring. Although due to the size differences, house cat size Khajiit and basically tiger size Khajiits, some combinations are, let's say, hard to pull off, or rather physically challenging, as one Elder Scrolls Online developer put it. Anyway, due to the inherent randomness of Khajiiti birth, there is no discrimination inside Elsewhere against any type of Khajiit. Each type of Khajiit, so each Furstock, is treated equal no matter which Furstock they belong to. This has made it so that some type of Khajiit are only very, very rarely seen outside of Elsewhere, some types do get discriminated or mistreated outside of Khajiiti society, both intentionally and unintentionally by non-Khajiit. But that does bring us to the different types of Furstock. There are 17 in total of them, although one could say that there are 9 types of Furstock with 8 subtypes, depending on how you view it. This is since each type of Furstock, except the main, which is a variant we'll talk about later, each type has a bigger variant of Furstock with the rat suffix behind it. So you've got, for example, the Pamar, and then you've got the Pamar rat, both born under different moon phases, but in most Furstock cases essentially the same type of Khajiit, just bigger and in most cases a bit more bestial in their physiology. But since the Khajiit themselves treat these rat types different as Furstocks, and some have a bit more differences in just being bigger, we will as well in this video. We'll treat them as different. And we're starting with one of the Furstocks that people will likely be most familiar with, the Cathay. The Cathay are one of the Furstock of Khajiit that are playable in Skyrim and Oblivion, and according to the developers, the only Furstock playable in the Elder Scrolls Online. These are the Khajiit most people think of when the word Khajiit is thrown around. And they are one of the races most common outside of Elsewhere, and this Furstock is born under these moons when Messer is in his waxing phase and Secunda is in its full phase. Their bigger and more bestial versions, the Cathay Rat, are born when Messer and Secunda are both in their waxing phase and are a bit rarer outside of Elsewhere. They're very similar to their non-rat counterparts, except that their bodies are more jaguar-like, as the Imperial Geographical Society puts it in their pocket guides, and they are faster and more agile than their non-rat counterparts. It's also most common to find them with jaguar fur patterns, although they can appear with other fur patterns as well. Next up we've got the Suthay, another playable Furstock, which is born when Messer and Secunda are both new, so when it seems like there's no moons at all present in the skies. The Suthe are very similar to the Cathay. They are one of the most common types of Khajiit, and the only noticeable difference I could find between the Suthe and the Cathay is that the Suthe are a bit more leopard-like in their facial features, other than the Cathay, which are more like a real-life puma. But that could just be attributed to the examples that we have that are confirmed to belong to these races, or to these Furstocks. It's theorized that the Suthe is one of the Furstocks that a player can belong to in Skyrim and Oblivion, depending on the choices in the character menu. Their Rat variant, or the Suthe Rat, which is born when Masr is in its new phase and Secunda is in its waning phase, is also probably familiar to many, as it's the Khajiiti Furstock that we play as in Morrowind, and which we see in the Elder Scrolls Redguard. They are more agile and are able to jump higher than their non-Rat counterparts, and they are also better sneakers. However, when we compare the Suthe and Cathay Furstock, including their Rat counterparts, it seems that the Cathay come out on top when talking about physical prowess and warrior capabilities, as the Cathay and their Rat counterparts apparently have more muscle mass than the Suthe on average. Next up, let's talk about the Toujay. We don't have much on either the Toujay or the Toujay Rats. They seem very similar to the Cathay, with the notable exception that their leg structure is different. So far, both the Cathay and Suthe have been Furstock with plantigrade leg structure, while these guys have a digitigrade leg structure. This low resolution image on screen right now is the best way to simply explain the difference visually. Now, we haven't seen the Toujay in any of the games, although that's probably because the developers could not be bothered to make a different leg structure model, so it's possible that we have seen them, but just not in their lore accurate way. Except with this confirmed statue of a Toujay and a confirmed statue of a Toujay Rat that we do have in Elder Scrolls Online, but just no NPCs of this kind. We do know, however, that the Toujay are born when Masr is in its waxing phase and Secunda is in its new phase, and the Toujay Rat, we know that they are born when Masr is waxing and Secunda is waning. Something interesting on the Toujay Rat, however, seems to be that they have more rounded ears like a cheetah and are more cheetah-like, while the regular Toujay seem to be a little bit more leopard-like, but that could just be the example statues that we have. Again, these are the only confirmed Toujay that we have. Anyway, pretty interesting. Next up, we've got the Pamar Furstock and the Pamar Rat Furstock. There seems to be no real striking difference between the two variants this time, other than the size and the strength. Both the Pamar and the Pamar Rats resemble very large tigers. Both Furstock are bipedal, so walk on two legs, and are both considered to be very strong. They have large muscle mass and are less agile than all the previous races, but they are, especially the Pamar Rat, which are stronger and larger than their non-Rat counterparts. They are the best warriors of Elsewhere and the largest upright walking Khajiit Furstock. The regular Pamar is born when Masr in its full phase and Secunda is in its new phase, while the Pamar Rats are born when Masr is in its full phase and Secunda is in its waning phase. But the Pamar are not the largest Furstock in general, as we still have the Sentia, and specifically the Sentia Rat, which holds that honor. The Sentia, which is born when Masr and Secunda are in their full phases, are large cats, larger than a grown horse, which walk on four legs. They most resemble large lions with the ears of a lynx. They are said to be very intelligent, and some train themselves to be efficient war steeds for fellow Khajiit Furstocks which walk on two legs, as they are the fastest Furstock around and almost the strongest, the ideal steed for on the battlefield, as both the steed and rider are then intelligent beings. Now, the Sentia Rat is even bigger, although it's a bit slower and less agile than their non-Rat counterparts. They're born when Masr is in its full phase and Secunda is in its waxing phase, and they have a slightly shorter and straighter legs, and they have a shorter body span than their non-Rat variants. However, they make up their decrease in speed with an increase in muscle mass and raw physical strength. These are the strongest Furstock by far, and despite being slower, they are still very fast compared to other Furstock. The Sentia Rat also often train themselves as war steeds, as they are fearsome on the battlefield, but apparently they dislike being ridden by other Khajiit a bit more than their non-Rat counterparts, who don't really seem to mind as long as they're being treated with respect. Meanwhile, the Sentia Rat seems to generally dislike being ridden more. Both the Sentia and Sentia Rat are very rarely seen outside of Elsewhere, as non-Khajiit usually mix them up with beasts and non-intelligent creatures like lions, leading to degrading situations outside of Khajiiti society. This is why they often keep themselves inside elsewhere, as among the Khajiit they will get the respect they deserve, since the Sentia and the Sentiarat are every bit as intelligent as the other Furstock, and are even able to use magic. Although, due to their four-legged nature, they often need help from others to equip any armor or clothing, which is kinda funny. And according to some Daggerfall/Morrowind era lore, both the Sentia and Sentiarat have twice as long forelegs as their hind legs, which we don't see in any of the games, so that's probably even retconned. Anyway, lore. Another Furstock of Khajiit, which is only rarely seen outside of elsewhere, are the Alfiq. This Furstock is born when Masr is waning and Secunda is full. It's very similar in size and appearance to a regular house cat. And this is immediately the reason why they are so rarely seen outside of elsewhere, as it often leads to non-Khajiit treating them like house cats, wanting to cuddle them and keep them as pets. We even have the case of the Alfiq Janessa in the Elder Scrolls Online, who has been kidnapped because people thought that she was a cute stray cat, which would make an adorable pet. But yeah, while they're undeniably very cute, they are also remarkably intelligent. They can speak, and they are apparently gifted in magic, particularly compared to other Furstock. What's funny, however, is that while they dislike being seen as house cats, in times of war, Alfiq will pose as stray cats or even house cats as spies and informants in times of war with the enemies of elsewhere. Also, just like both Sentia Furstock, the Alfiq, and their Rat variation, which we'll talk about in a bit, cannot equip their own clothes and need to be helped due to their four-leg nature. Now, of their Rat version we know very little, other than that they are born when Masr is in its waning phase and Secunda is in its waxing phase. It's also logical to conclude that they are a bit bigger than their non-Rat counterparts, which means that they may be the size and perhaps the shape of a bit of a lynx. Some people in the community heavily theorize that they may look like lynxes, but we don't have any actual in-game evidence for that. For all we could know, the Alfiq Rat could just look exactly similar to the Alfiq, and we may see several in Elder Scrolls Online. Maybe this is the one with the least differences. I guess we just don't know until it's clarified. Something else we don't actually know until it's clarified is what happened to the Omus Furstock. By far the strangest type of Khajiit, in my opinion at least. They are born when Masr is in its new phase and Secunda is in its full phase, and they are almost indistinguishable from Bosmer, so from Wood Elves in their appearance. They have no fur, they have no tails, and they are basically exactly the same as Bosmer's, save for their internal biology. This is the type of Khajiit that we see everywhere in the Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall, so the first two installments of the series. And it's said that they often paint their faces in elsewhere to resemble cats and fit in with the other Furstock. Pretty interesting, but a shame we have not seen them since Daggerfall, except for this statue of an Omus Rat in the Elder Scrolls Online, meaning that they have not been retconned or forgotten, we just don't see them. As the Omus Rat are essentially the same as the Omus, except they have very light fur on their skin, which is also very short, and they do in fact have a tail, as you can see in this statue. Due to the human-like nature of their morphology, they also paint their faces in elsewhere to fit in, and they are born when Masr is in its new phase and Secunda is in its waxing phase. But then again, we haven't seen these guys together with the regular Omus since Arena and Daggerfall, except for this one statue of an Omus Rat. Now, the final type of regular Khajiit Furstock are the Dagi and the Dagi Rat. These are once again bipedal Khajiiti Furstock, so they walk on two legs, and we see them from time to time in the Elder Scrolls Online, although they do seem to be rarer than other types of bipedal Khajiit Furstock. Their Rat counterpart looks very similar to the non-Rat counterpart, as both have lynx-like head shapes, and they are generally shorter than most other Furstocks, with the Rat variant being slightly bigger. They're the lightest type of Furstock, save for the Alfiq, and the lightest type of bipedal Furstock in general. They are the most agile type of Khajiit, and they are often seen living in the trees in the jungles, preferring tree houses and being able to move among the trees like monkeys. The regular Dagi are born when Masr is waning and Secunda is in its new phase, while the Dagi Rat are born when Masr and Secunda are both in their waning phases. Now, the rarest Khajiit Furstock by far is born when the two moons align and a dark eclipse occurs. This type of Furstock is a main, and due to the extreme rarity of this type of Furstock, the mains have traditionally held revered positions and spiritual leaders in elsewhere. This means that, opposite to what many people may think, the main is not the political leader of elsewhere, but more or less its religious leader, comparable to the Pope and the Dalai Lama in our own universe. The main usually functions as a largely neutral figure in elsewhere's politics, often acting as a peacemaker between the political rulers. Some mains are even so apolitical that they appoint a speaker for themselves who handles their political tasks. These people would become speakers of the main, and those are actually political figures. In some depictions of the idea of the main being a peacemaker, the whole idea gets taken even further, where they state that the main is essentially the glue that's holding Elsewhere together, as he or she embodies all ways of life and all represents all clans of Khajiit in Elsewhere. For example, during the formation of the Elsewhere Confederacy in the early Second Era, the main at the time, Tar Redata, was a peacemaker. There was a lot of conflict among the tribes within Elsewhere at the time, and the two kingdoms of Anaquina and Palatine were also at each other's throats. So the main intervened as a neutral figure and revealed what was called the Riddle Thar Epiphany. Essentially, this epiphany was a new way of governing based on the phases of the moons, with the main himself standing at the center of it all as its neutral leader of all Khajiiti people and head of their religion. From that moment on, the main would be the undisputed spiritual ruler of all Khajiiti people, which is why the main Tar Redata is often credited with the title of the first main of Elsewhere. That isn't to say that there weren't mains before him, but the mains before him were often simply aligned to one of the tribes or kingdoms, as there's evidence that the main has existed for a long time before Tar Redata took on the title of the first main of Elsewhere. For example, we've had evidence of mains being an influence in Elsewhere since the First Era and maybe even earlier. Back then, the mains were the spiritual leaders of their own tribes, or in some cases even spiritual leaders over multiple tribes. It is during this period that the name main actually came to be, as within Khajiiti tribes it was tradition for the Khajiit of the tribe to all shave off their own manes in honor of their spiritual leader, and then bring him a lock of their own manes, which their spiritual leader would then braid into his own mane. This is what gave the main his name, as the main would carry with him parts of the manes of his entire tribe. Over time, as this tradition remained while the Khajiiti tribes eventually grew into the 16 kingdoms, this tradition became very impractical, as the kingdoms would become bigger and bigger until the main was so weighed down by the mass of all the Khajiiti hair that he could eventually no longer walk by himself and needed to be carried around on a palanquin. We actually have this interesting piece of concept art from the early days of the Elder Scrolls series showing why this became very impractical. As you can see, the main is completely covered in hair from all the Khajiit in his kingdom or tribe. Because of this impracticality, the main would often no longer wear the manes of all those in the kingdom and rather only wear braids of hair from his own warrior guard and the closest of his own tribe. This is what we can actually see in the Elder Scrolls Online, where the main Akuzri has braids of hair of his own guardsmen and his tribe attached to his helmet. That said, the Khajiiti believe that everything in their lives is dictated by the phases of the moon, which they call the lunar lattice. The main is supposed to be the ruler of the lunar lattice and chief interpreter of the moons. For example, if a few moon priests disagree on something pertaining to the moons, then the main can break their argument up, as his word is always final, as he is seen as the ultimate authority on the lunar lattice. Within the main's palace in the city of Torval, the main spends a lot of his time meditating to the moons and on the moons. The reason for this is that the main actually has a very special connection to the moons, and it is in fact, sometimes there's a very rare occurrence of the two moons overlapping each other in a lunar eclipse. During one of these eclipses, the Khajiit believe that a third moon is shown, the dark moon. Those born at the exact moment of Messer and Secunda's overlap in a perfect eclipse are branded as born under the dark moon and are very sensitive to the effects of the moons. Those born under the dark moon are the race of Khajiit who will become the mains of Elsewhere. Their birth is a very rare occurrence and makes it so that usually there's only one Khajiit alive at a given time who was born exactly at the moment of the eclipse, leading to many Khajiit to believe that there is in fact only one main who is born in a different body every time, like reincarnation. Although this isn't necessarily the case, as sometimes it happens that multiple Khajiit are actually born under the dark moon and that they all exist at the same time. If there's already a main ruling over Elsewhere, and if then another Khajiit is born under the dark moon during their rule, they become lunar champion, destined to succeed the main once the main passes away. Now, here's where things become a bit vague, as next to the lunar champions we also have what are called forgotten mains. We don't exactly know how the system works, but it seems like lunar champions are always the Khajiit that are born under the most recent dark moon. So if a main is ruling and one is born under the dark moon, they become the lunar champion. But if the main stays alive for long enough for another eclipse to occur, then the lunar champion becomes a forgotten main and the Khajiit born under the most recent eclipse becomes the lunar champion. Forgotten mains usually devote themselves to the protection of Elsewhere, joining the Pride of Alkosh, and they will be raised as powerful warriors to protect Elsewhere. That being said, those born under the Dark Moon are actually more sensitive to the phases of the moon and are also more easily corruptible due to the power of the Dark Moon, and are susceptible to the power of the so-called Dark Heart. Now, what exactly is that Dark Heart, you may ask? Well, that's a subject for its own video, but in short, the Dark Heart is another fragment of Lorkhan made out of pure void, which can corrupt the Khajiit into Dro Ma'atra, servants of the Daedric Prince of Namira. As born under the Dark Moon, the mains are far more susceptible to this darkness of Namira, and thus there have been examples of mains falling to the darkness and their souls being claimed by Namira, making them no longer fit to lead the Khajiiti people, and having them succeeded by their lunar champions. But when a main does not fall to Namira's darkness and rather dies naturally or in combat or something like that, they are usually entombed in the Tomb of Mains in the Rimmen necropolis, after which they will be succeeded by their lunar champion. Now, some interesting notes here are that during the Second Era there was a unique occurrence, as during the reign of the main Akuzuri, who we can meet in the Elder Scrolls Online, a Khajiiti mother gave birth to twins during the eclipse, making it so that for the first time in Khajiiti history there were two lunar champions who both had the right to succeed the main, as they were both born at the same time during the most recent eclipse. As player, you can accompany the two lunar champions, Shaza and Kali, and ultimately you, as the player, can influence who of them becomes the main to succeed Akuzuri after several trials. Another interesting tidbit is that during the early 4th era, the main of Elsewhere was actually assassinated for unknown reasons. We don't exactly know who did it or why they did it. The Empire suspects that the Thalmor did it, but we don't really have conclusive proof for that, nor do we know whether there is a main during the period of Skyrim.
Alright, now that having been said, let's talk about something else which is integral to Khajiiti culture, their language, Ta'agra.
We've got quite a few pieces of lore to explore about the language, so in this video I'll give you a broad overview of Ta'agra, so the Khajiiti language, some of its grammar rules and some of its peculiarities. So, as I said before, the Khajiiti language is called Ta'agra. It's a highly melodic, guttural and expressive language. One of the most recognizable features of Ta'agra, and the one that most Elder Scrolls fans are probably most familiar with, is the use of the third person to refer to oneself. Be it via the Khajiit's name by referring to the race, or by using this one. Examples of this are when, for example, Jazargo says, "Jazargo is an accomplished destruction mage," or the famous sentence, "Khajiit has wares if you have coin," which is spoken by Khajiit traders all around Tamriel. And also in something like, "This one is glad to be of help." So that's all referring to oneself in the third person. Other notable features of Ta'agra include the frequent uses of the letters J, R and S. The J is often always a soft one, not being pronounced like a hard J like in Jane, Jade and so on. A hard J would often, but not always, happen with the inclusion of the letter H after it. S is also a very frequently used letter, and it's very often frequently treated as its own syllable, marked with an apostrophe like in the word surrender. Talking about apostrophes, they themselves are also a very common sight in Ta'agra, and the R is basically always a rolled one, and I really can't do it, but you'll hear some of them in Mr. Nerd Dragon's voice clips later on. An interesting grammatical feature of Ta'agra is its sentence structure. In English the verb comes before the subject, but in Ta'agra the verb comes after it. For example, the sentence
Zwing fodurar rabi
translates to "I have a yellow writing utensil," so a quill. But the most literal translation without adapting the sentence structure would be "yellow writing utensil have" in the first person. In other words, the Ta'agra sentence structure is verb, subject, object instead of subject, verb, object, which brings me to the real life inspiration to Ta'agra, which is probably Arabic, because Arabic also follows the same sentence structure, and it's both thematically and phonetically similar to Ta'agra. So Mr. Nerd Dragon and I presume that it's a direct inspiration. Now, we'll cover some of the more important words in Ta'agra and also some of their name conventions. Starting with the word Khajiit. It's a composite of two words, Kash meaning sand, and It is a suffix that indicates occupation or place of residence. So the most accurate translation for Khajiit would be desert walker or desert dweller. Khajiiti names are most commonly describing the skills or abilities of those that they refer to. Family names are a rarity, and a Khajiit would make their name more unique by adding an eponym in either Ta'agra or in Tamrielic, like Ma'ik the Liar or Kreen Rendo. A big part of Khajiit naming convention is to use honorifics. It's a reflection of their status in society and therefore may change during their life depending on the context and depending on the flow of their life. It's considered extremely rude and insulting to address someone without an honorific or without the appropriate honorific. The rule is that only one honorific may be applied at a time, although two can be used. This is rare. However, since the Khajiit believe using two honorifics is a sign of either great pride or great ignorance, it's very rare. It is also very rare for a non-Khajiit to have a Khajiiti honorific applied to their names, but when it happens it's usually when it's a very important person in Khajiiti society, such as a foreign ambassador or such whom the Khajiiti respect greatly and has an influence on their society. The honorifics are usually applied at the start of one's name, or in other words as a prefix separated from the name by an apostrophe or a hyphen. Although in some cases it can be a suffix, so be placed after the name. When speaking the common language, so Tamrielic, the honorific is treated as an actual part of the name, since honorifics aren't used this way in Tamrielic. As a curiosity, this use of honorifics is very similar to the real-life Japanese language, although they apparently have their honorifics almost always at the end of the name, such as san or kun. If that's not true, you can correct me in the comments if there's also prefix versions of honorifics in Japanese. I honestly don't know, I'm not a Japanese expert. But to get back to the Khajiiti language, just to show what I mean, I've got a list of Khajiiti honorifics which I'm putting on the screen now. The honorifics on the left are for males and the ones on the right are for females. As you can see, some of the Khajiiti names in the games make a lot more sense now. If you look at the bottom of the list, you can see that Re is an honorific granted to chieftains, kings and even the main. For example, Re Saad is the chief of the merchants in Skyrim and has this honorific, as has Akuz Re, which is the main of Elsewhere in the Elder Scrolls Online. Also in Skyrim there's a Khajiit trader called Dro Marash. We may conclude that he's an older Khajiit called Marash, who is seen as very wise or is seen as patriarch of his family, hence why he has the honorific Dro. Jazargo is a young Khajiit called Zargo who is single, and so on. Knowing this, if you know a Khajiiti name, you can actually know something about the personality or about the kind of person that the Khajiit is, depending on the honorifics that are applied to their name. Anyway, let's move on from the names for now, because there's a few instances in the game that we're actually able to read Ta'agra phrases or even hear Khajiiti speaking Ta'agra. The closest that we get to hearing an actual conversation in Ta'agra is between Cyrus and a Khajiit named Saatra in the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, in which the latter speaks Ta'agra frequently during the conversation. Here's a quick sample.
You should know you got me the job.
Next to this conversation, there's also a few texts that we can find about Ta'agra, like the book
Azir Trajijazeri.
that we can find in multiple Elder Scrolls games. A nice example of a complete sentence in Ta'agra would be in the burnt scripture found in the Moongrave Fane in the Elder Scrolls Online, which reads as follows.
Zengrili an Zengji Tazjadi Afa Shabar Aidifozei Zaiguti Salitatna Jadi Ranjif Adivasanirni Jadi Lurma Rajkono Viti Shabar Morna Anfsi Kajait Harifse.
Which translates into Joan and Jode close their eyes, in the dreamless sleep of death they fall, until below the world they lie, forever lost in darkness, and the true moon reigns supreme.
And that's basically all I could gather on the Khajiiti language. Now next up, let's talk about their religion and their creation myth, as those are very important aspects of their culture.
Now, before we begin with the creation myths, I can already tell you that it's important to remember that most Khajiiti deities are variations of Imperial/Elven deities. Although the Khajiit themselves will always claim that they are entirely different deities from those deities that we know. Whether this is the case is debatable, or whether the creation myth itself even checks out at all with the reality. It probably won't. But today we will cover what the Khajiit believe. So according to the Khajiit, in the beginning of everything, there was but two entities known as the Littermaids, Anur and Fedome. Fedome said to Anur, "Let us wed and make children to share our happiness." And so from their bond, Alkosh, the first cat, was born. They made him the guardian of time, saying, "Alkosh, we give you time for what is as fast or as slow as a cat." They gave birth then to Knarthi, the winds.
Kenarthi, to you we give the sky, for what can fly higher than the wind?
They gave birth to Magnus, the cat's eye. Magnus, to you we give the sun, for what is brighter than the eye of a cat. They gave birth to Mara, the mother cat. Mara, you are love, for what is more loving than a mother? They gave birth to Srendar, the runt. Srendar, we give you mercy, for how does a runt survive except by mercy? And then, from many phases, Anur and Fedome were happy. Anur then said, we should have more children to share our happiness. Fedome agreed. Then they had Hamora. Hamora, you are the tides, for who can say whether the moons predict the tides or the tides predict the moons? They had Hircine. Hircine, you are the hungry cat, for what hunts better than a cat with an empty belly? They had Maruz.
Maroons, you are the Khajiit, for what is more destructive than a kitten?
They had Mafala. Mafala, you are the clan mother, for what is more secretive than the ways of the clan mothers? They had Senjin. Senjin, you are the blood cat, for who can control the urges of blood? And they had Shagarath. Shagarath, are you the skooma cat, for what is crazier than a cat on skooma? And then Anur said, 2 litters is enough, for too many children will steal our happiness. But then, one day Khenarthi approached Fedome and said, Fedome, mother, Khenarthi grows so lonely high above the world where not even my brother Alkosh can fly. Fedome, hearing this, then took pity on her and tricked Anur to have even more children, probably knowing that he wouldn't be happy. And Fedome gave birth to the moons and their motions, and then later she gave birth to Narini, the spirit of the majestic sands and the lush forests. Later on, she had Azura, the spirit of dusk and dawn. From the beginning, Narini and Azura would fight over for their mother's favor. But Anur caught Fedome while she was still birthing and got very, very angry. He then attacked Fedome, making her flee to far away in the great darkness to give birth to the last of her litter. Fedome's children all heard what had happened, and they all came to protect her from Anur's great anger, to prevent him from hurting Fedome even more. The last child of Fedome was born, and it was called Lorkaj. When he was born, his heart was filled with the great darkness which took shape and realized its name, Namira. Fedome, wounded by Anur's strike, realized that her time was near, and she spoke to the moon, saying,
Jakajay, to you Fadomai gives the lattice, for what is steadier than the phases of the moons? Your eternal motions will protect us from Anur's anger.
The moons then took their places on the heavens. Anur, furious, tried to shoot the great darkness, but he could not cross the lattice. Then Fedome turned her attention to Narini, saying, Narini, to you Fedome leaves her greatest gift. You will birth to many people, as Fedome gave birth today. Narini then left, but noticing that her rival Azura had nothing, she smiled victoriously. After that, all of Fedome's children left, except for the loyal and caring Azura. Fedome said to her, to you, my favorite daughter, Fedome leaves her greatest gift. To you, Fedome leaves her secrets. And she told Azura, when Narini is filled with her children, take one of them and change them. Make them the fastest, cleverest and most beautiful people and call them the Khajiit. The Khajiit must be the best climbers, for if Messer and Secunda fail, they must climb Khenarthi's breath to set the moons back in their courses. The Khajiit must be the best deceivers, for they must always hide their nature from the children of Anur. The Khajiit must be the best survivors, for Narini will be jealous, and she will make the sands harsh and the forest unforgiving. And the Khajiit will always be hungry, and at war with Narini. With these words, Fedome died in her daughter's arms. After many phases, Narini spoke to Lorkaj. Lorkaj, Fedome told me to give birth to many children, but there is no place to them. Lorkaj then said, Lorkaj makes a place for the children, and Lorkaj puts you there so you can give birth. But Lorkaj's heart was filled with the great darkness, and he tricked his siblings so that they were forced into this new place with Narini. Many of them escaped though, and became the stars. But also many of them died, trying to make Narini's path stable. The survivors, filled with rage for being tricked, punished Lorkaj, tearing off his heart and hiding it deep within Narini, saying, we curse you, noisy Lorkaj, to walk Narini for many phases. This curse is actually related to the speculated Skyrim curse, and with the whole story of the avatars of Shore, which I'm not an expert on. Narini, though, forgave Lorcash, for he was the one who provided her with a place to give birth and have children. Narini then filled herself with children, but cried when she realized that all her favorite children, the Forest People, did not know their shape, and they were in a permanent state of chaos, confusion and sadness. Azura, ignoring their bitter rivalry, took pity on Narini and said to her,
Poor Nirni, stop your tears. Azura makes for you a gift of a new people.
When Narini stopped weeping, Azura headed to her, but first she would have to pass through the moons, which guarded Narini and her world. Azura then told them the first secret of Fanome, and they let her through. Azura then took some of the Forest People who were torn between man and beast, and placed them on the best deserts and forests of Narini. In her wisdom, Azura made them of many shapes, being one for every purpose. When they were done, Azura named them Khajiit, and told them the second secret of Fanome, also teaching them the value of secrets, and she then bound the Khajiit to the lunar lattice, as is proper for Narini's secret defenders. Then Azura spoke the third secret of Fanome, and the moon shone down on the marshes and their light became sugar. But unfortunately, the deity Ephraim had heard the first secret of Fanome and snuck behind Azura when she entered Narini. Ephraim didn't appreciate secrets, and he told Narini all about Azura's trick. Enraged, Narini made the deserts hot and the sands biting, and made the forests wet and filled with poisons in appreciation for Ephraim's service. She also let him change the Forest People, now different from the Khajiit. But Ephraim didn't have the subtle wisdom that Azura had, making them remaining Forest People, never changing elves, forbidding them to have the shape of beasts, and he named them the Bosmer, and bound them to the Green Pact. Since they were not anymore in the same litter as the Khajiit, it made them bitter enemies to the Khajiit. And because Ephraim had no appreciation for secrets, he shouted the first secret of Fanome across the heavens with all the might of his lungs, to make it possible for all of Fanome's children to cross the lattice. But Azura was quick and clever, and only closed the ears of angry Anur and noisy Lorcash, so they were the only ones not to hear it. The Khajiiti myths explain not only their origin and the origin of the world, but also their link to the moons and their anonomy toward the Bosmer, and many other aspects of their culture. Many Imperial scholars point to some contradictions in these myths, and I must agree when I read it all.
But Khajiiti culture is not just a contradictory creation myth, because next up we will talk about something else very integral to their society, their love and marriage traditions. How do the Khajiit treat marriage and partnership? We'll find out now. First and foremost, we know that polyamory seems to be rather common among Khajiit compared to the other races, although it's unknown if this continues after marriage ceremonies in the form of all-out polygamy. Also, we know that the names of Khajiit, or at least their honorifics, change upon marriage, since there are specific honorifics for single lads and ladies, like the J in Jezargo, for instance. If he was to marry, he would no longer use the honorific J. Maybe that's why you can't actually marry Jezargo in Skyrim, as they would have to change his name to just Zargo, or Dar Zargo, or Do Zargo, which are honorifics for clever and warrior Khajiit, respectively. Now, other than that, we know that Mara is their goddess of love, but it's also likely that Azura or Narini, their gods, may have some role in their marriage traditions, giving the importance of them to Khajiiti culture, and maybe the moons even have a role in their marriages, as you know, the moons are even more important in their culture, but it's all just a guess, as we literally know nothing about Khajiiti marriages other than that they exist, as we do have some examples of, for example, political marriages, and we have some example of Khajiit calling other Khajiit husbands or wives. But even though we know not that much about their marriage traditions, we do know quite a bit about what they do in marriage with their partner. In a bed. You know, sex. Just a disclaimer, not only in marriage, but I thought it was a nice bridge. Anyway, let's talk about Khajiit sex.
The Khajiit are quite an interesting bunch. For one, multiple sources describe the Khajiit as having barbed penises, making intercourse with Khajiit extremely painful for any non-Khajiit, and presumably also painful for other Khajiit. Now, second, they are one of the races which we actually know that they produce quite some pornographic items in terms of art and literature. They have a reputation for being quite promiscuous and pretty open about sex, which they call zoop zoop, by the way. in case you wanted to know. Now, in addition to their pretty open and casual attitude to sex, we know that the Khajiit are one of the races, together with the Bosmer and in some aspects the Argonians, who really just don't mind seeing other people on the side next to their partner. And yeah, they are one of the few races in which group-based intercourse is actually seen as pretty normal, apparently. So yeah, good stuff. One interesting thing here though is that since sex is also meant for procreation and not just for pleasure, I would think that the Khajiit likely time their sexual escapades consciously. Let me explain. There are many different types of Khajiit in the Elder Scrolls universe, and which type a baby Khajiit becomes is dependent on the stance of the moons during their birth. This determines everything about the type of Khajiit that they will become, from a small house cat-like Alfiq Khajiit to the large and mighty Sencharat. I would think that Khajiiti parents, considering the stances of the moons are predictable, would be able to time their time of intercourse in a way where they would be able to get the type of Khajiit child that they want. So it's possible that some Khajiit do that, but we have no actual confirmation of that, so it's just speculation from my side.
Now, one more thing that we know about in the area of romance and sex are the Khajiiti beauty standards. What do Khajiit find attractive in a partner? Well, I'll tell you.
Interestingly enough, since there are so many types of Khajiit, or Furstocks as they call it themselves, it seems that there aren't really any body types or fur patterns which are considered especially attractive in Khajiiti culture, likely because there are so many different ones. That being said, there are a few universal rules for Khajiiti attractiveness, it seems to be, some of which I personally find to be pretty hilarious. A great example is of how straight and unbroken whiskers are one of the sexiest things for a Khajiit apparently. Khajiit take this very seriously, I mean very seriously. Some of them even use little clips to bind their whiskers to bamboo twigs while they sleep, so their whiskers don't wrinkle in their sleep. Good stuff. Other than that, they have a saying, claws make the cat, meaning that their claws need to be polished, neatly trimmed and sharp to boot. Now, the Khajiit ideal is smooth and unknitted fur, which appears sleek and shiny to the eye. Because of this, there are many fur products to make their fur shine and fur brushes to untangle knits in the fur, as knitted fur seems to be a signal of being untidy and slobbish. Now, a final thing to note about Khajiiti beauty standards is that green eyes are apparently considered to be especially attractive, as they are quite rare.
And that's about all I can say about romance, sex and beauty standards. Now let's talk about another part of Khajiiti culture. Let's talk about how they view death and what their afterlife beliefs are like and how they bury their dead. Let's talk about it.
The Khajiit follow the precipice of the Riddle Thar, which isn't a god but more like a concept. The Riddle Thar sets guidelines which all Khajiit must follow, and after death they would be separated between true cats and band cats, according to how they followed the path which was laid out to them by the Riddle Thar. True cats would be the ones who looked for and followed the right trail incessantly, trying the many different paths laid out by Joan and Jode. Following the right trail the whole of your life though is rough, and many Khajiit would grow bored with the chase and eventually turn into band cats as they call it. That's why the Khajiit give a big importance to the many moon priests all around elsewhere, who help them stay on the right trail by sharing stories of their ancestors, telling tales of inspiration, and sometimes, as the book The Trail and Tide states, swatting the ones who stray upon their flanks until they return to the paths that the moons weave. When a Khajiit, which is considered to be a true cat, dies, their soul is taken by Canarthi to Lieswer, which is the sands behind the stars, which is sort of Khajiit Sovngarde/heaven, to play and pray until the next pounds. It's said that in Lieswer the dunes are made out of pure sugar, and the moonlight chorus delights all the cats with their song. Also, it's interesting that it's Canarthi who guides their souls to the afterlife, either directly to the sands behind the stars or to Azura to be judged. This is interesting because it parallels some Nord beliefs. Band cats, on the other hand, are taken by Namira to the dark behind the world to serve Lorcash and his frightful heart, essentially becoming Dro Ma'atra, or corrupted Khajiit. Anyway, another interesting piece of lore is that the Khajiit have their own variant, or so to speak, of Arceus consecrations. Dro Ma'atra, or a corrupted Khajiit, might try to bend a cat's soul and take it into the dark in a ritual called the Bend Dance, but this can be avoided by the ways of Joan and Jode, as those sort of consecrations are called. As for the burial traditions, the Khajiit usually bury their dead, resting their remains in coffins. The departed usually rest with their most valuable possessions or relics, and it's also very common for families to be buried together in the same place. Such burials are protected, or at least theoretically, by the moon priests. And there's something to consider though, and that's the difference between the burials of the Khajiit from Anaquina and the Khajiit from Palatine. Anaquina Khajiit mark their graves with a cairn of stones, and they don't really do much preparation on the corpse itself, for they believe that the desert will help preserve them longer. The Palatine Khajiit, on the other hand, bury their deceased underground, marking the spot with a single gravestone. Like the Anaquine cousins, they don't really prepare the body for burial, though it's for different reasons, since the humidity of the jungle of Palatine will rot the corpses faster, so there's no really preparation needed. There's also a difference between city Khajiit and tribal Khajiit and how they will treat their dead. City Khajiit are usually way richer, and some of the most rich and noble might even build grand tombs and mausoleums, housing generations of dead relatives and their treasure. But regardless of the Anaquine or Palatine origin of a city-dwelling Khajiit or even a tribal Khajiit, a common practice revolves around planting waning lilies on burial sites. So all Khajiit essentially do this, because these waning lilies symbolize the remembrance of those who departed. Now, as for necromancy, pretty much none of the Khajiit are anointed with arcane consecrations, not only due to the unique Khajiit religion, but also due to their emphasis of soul over body. So, after death, they don't really care about the body, which is pretty clear, as they don't really work anything on the body anyway. So, Khajiit generally don't really care about a grave being robbed even, which is rather unique among any other race of Tamriel. And as such, necromancy is quite common in elsewhere, as bodies are easily to obtain, and the Khajiit don't really seem to care all that much.
Now, something else which is quite common in elsewhere, which the Khajiit really do care about, is personal defense, specifically martial arts. Of all the races and cultures of Tamriel, the Khajiit have the most types of martial arts. This is because the Khajiit are equipped with a nice standard weapon, their claws.
Therefore, instead of calling them schools of fighting or martial arts, the Khajiit call their martial arts claw dances, and there are several different types or schools of claw dances which have been developed over the years. Each of the types of Khajiit claw dances has their own following, with entire monasteries and orders of priests dedicated to preserving them and teaching them. The funny thing is that most priests in these temples and monasteries do not practice these martial arts or claw dances as a literal martial art meant for fighting, but rather as a form of meditation in motion, with most claw dances having set patterns of moves which can be repeated to serve as a way of meditating in motion. In fact, the claw dances themselves originated with the monks in these monasteries, who in ancient times sought for ways to fight back against the ancient Khajiiti warlord, the tyrant Tekkanzin the Striped Death, who attacked the temples, exiling the monks of ancient elsewhere. He drove the monks from the cities, and after almost a century in which the monks in exile had continually practiced their motion of meditation and perfected them into fighting styles or claw dances, they returned to the cities and towns of elsewhere. They then taught their motion meditation ways, now developed into martial arts, to the people of elsewhere, so that the people could fight back against the tyrant and the other oppressors in elsewhere at the time. The claw dances inspired massive peasant uprisings, peasants who now had effective ways to fight back against their oppressors. Now, these peasants and monks and their descendants over the years never forgot the power that they could wield with the claw dances, which freed them from their oppressors in the past, and thus the claw dances were passed on from generation to generation into modern day elsewhere. Now, from the lore we learn of the existence of 4 types of claw dances which have survived from ancient times. First is the Way of the Whispering Claw, then we have Gout Fang, we have Desert Wind and Desert Rain. Now, we know that all employ a great amount of discipline in the users, and the use of the claws of the Khajiit to a degree in their fighting styles, so not only weapons, with some combining weapons into the claw dances and some using no weapons in the claw dances. Now, let's begin with Whispering Claw, or Ziskura in the language of the Khajiit. Video on that language, by the way, is in the description of the video if you want to know more about the language of the Khajiit. Now, Whispering Claw is a fighting style of fast and silent movement. It requires fast reflexes and a good balance and control of one's body, as it employs advanced jumps and acrobatics in its fighting style. It's ideal for killing and can be used effectively in silence while sneaking around, meaning that this specific fighting style is often chosen by assassins. The Whispering Claw style is the polar opposite of the second style, Gout Fang or Vryn Tak in the Khajiiti language. While it's also fast-paced like the Whispering Claw, it relies on the strength of the wielder instead of speed and silence. Gautfang includes kicking, punching, grappling, and in some cases can be effectively complemented by weapon use, although only masters can effectively combine the unarmed side of the fighting style with weapon use without getting sloppy in their style, since effective use of Gautfang requires proper coordination of one's body and proper concentration. It is a claw dance which is very much based on instinct and interpreting the flow of energy in the body, as it doesn't have set patterns of sets of moves which belong together, meaning that it relies largely on the moment and on improvisation. Since it has no fixed set of moves, it also means that to become a true Gautfang master, just a study of moves and move patterns isn't enough. Rather, one needs to master their own body and the energy flows within themselves to call themselves a true master of Gautfang and to know which moves when to use. Now, finally, we have the styles of the Desert Wind and Desert Rain left in terms of Khajiit claw dances. These are both only half unarmed, as both heavily integrate weapons into their fighting style. While both use the claws, they can only be used effectively in combination with weapons for these two fighting styles. In fact, Desert Rain almost exclusively uses swords, with the only exception being agile kicks being integrated into the fighting style. Desert Wind, while also using weapons, apparently uses the paw claws of the Khajiit to a far larger degree, integrating them seamlessly with weapon use. I have to admit, we don't know much about either, except for the names and their degree of weapon use in complement with the claws and feet, but the exact moves of these styles are unknown, or what their movesets rely on.
Now, these martial arts are for the most part a really unique part of Khajiit culture, and something else that's really interesting about their culture is their musical tradition and the place of music in their society, as they're one of the more unique races on Tamriel when it comes to music.
The Khajiit clearly have Eastern and Arabic influences in their music. In terms of their musical styles, they often employ the hymn style of music, and they emphasize the R sound in their music. Generally, they use far lower tones of voice than the other races while singing, with the exception of the Argonians, who go very, very low. Sometimes they will employ the dissonance in their music, and what's interesting is they often employ a completely different musical skill than the other races of Tamriel, because the other races of Tamriel use the real-life Western scale for music, which uses 12 notes. The Khajiit instead seem to use a musical scale more reminiscent of the real-life Arabic scale, which uses 7 notes. In terms of the content of their songs, they often sing about their own culture, their history, their myths and their religion. And that the religion part is actually quite logical, because their goddess Kanarthi, which is also the goddess credited by them with giving music to the world, is partly worshipped by performing music. While they do have some light-hearted folk songs, even those seem to have a more professional and coherent composition than most of the folk songs of other cultures. Now, my music friend listened to all the song performances that we have, and he said that in terms of musical style, the Khajiit seem to be most consistent and mostly uniquely designed by the Elder Scrolls developers, which is pretty cool and definitely also goes for the rest of their musical tradition. Because for one, maybe except for the Argonians, the Khajiit definitely have the most unique array of instruments, because they have a couple of instruments that almost no other race uses. For one, they have the Khajiiti Qanun, which in the real world is an Arabic string instrument played while sitting down and plucking the strings of the instrument. They also use the Ezrash or Ezrai, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is an instrument based on the real-life Indian string instrument, which no other race on Tamriel seems to use, and in my opinion sounds pretty sick. I mean, listen to this.
They also seem to be the primary users of the Gezang instrument, which is based on the real-life Chinese instrument. And that's basically all that we know about the Khajiit musical tradition. Now, the next two topics that we will be talking about in this video are the kinds of food that the Khajiit like to eat and the kind of alcohols that they like to drink, starting with the alcohols.
We know of some of their ales, we know that they have some rum production and some wine production, but their products, in terms of what stands out, is that most of them are very sweet alcohols, such as their cane mead, which is mead made from moonsugar canes. But what they seem to specialize in are cordials, which are redistillations of stuff like brandy or rum with fruit and herbs mixed in. With their cordials being very sweet, just like the other stuff that they produce.
And honestly, the same goes kind of for their food, as the Khajiit really like their sweets.
Their cuisine contains a lot of sweet dishes cooked with moonsugar over campfires that the Khajiit set up during their travels. Almost every Khajiit cook knows of the black market and visits it regularly to get moonsugar to cook with when another Khajiit comes over for dinner. Due to the abundance of moonsugar in their culture, they have created a sort of tolerance for it, unrivaled by the other races. While moon sugar may be deadly for many other races when taken into large amounts, many Khajiit could not care less about the moon sugar in their food and they just find it tasty. Their dishes often include other exotic ingredients next to the moon sugar that they grow in elsewhere. Unfortunately, their daily cuisine does not have much ingredients from outside of elsewhere, since these days many merchants basically avoid the markets of elsewhere due to the illegal moon sugar trade there, which has made it so that foreign ingredients are hard to come by in elsewhere. My favorite Khajiit dish from the book is by far the skooma. I mean, you did not think that skooma would not be in this book. And I promise I'm soon gonna make some skooma live on video and then later drink it, as long as nobody reports me to the guard, of course. Another fun dish was the spiced warm milk with sugar and honey. It's milk, tasty for cats, mixed with moon sugar, tasty for Khajiit, and they apparently take it before bed to get to sleep. It's just warm milk with moon sugar, I like it.
Now that being said, I think now is a good time to talk about Elswere's political situation. First by talking about the ancient history of Elsewhere when it was divided into 16 tribes and then 16 kingdoms. Then talking about its political situation in the Second Era when it was part of the first Altmeri Dominion under Queen Irene during the events of the Elder Scrolls Online that we played through. And then about its situation in the Fourth Era during the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and presumably during the Elder Scrolls 6. But let's start with the very early Khajiiti history, the 16 kingdoms and 16 tribes period.
Back in the early Meretic era, when every race was still on their respective continents, so the Needs on Atmora, the Altmer on Altmuris, the Yokudans on Yokuda, there were 3 races already present on Tamriel, primarily in the south of the continent. These were the Argonians, the Kuthringi humans, and the Khajiit. Around this time, tribal life was the dominant way of life around Tamriel, with most of the Argonians, Khajiit, and Kuthringi living in tribal societies. That isn't to say that there weren't significant civilizations present on Tamriel at the time, they were just largely tribal. In Black Marsh, there was actually an exception, just like in Elsewhere. Because in Black Marsh the Argonians had forsaken that tribal lifestyle and had established the great Zenmir civilization. I'm not talking about all the Argonians, but at least a significant portion of it. Which was said to be the most advanced civilization on Tamriel around this time. But as I sort of shadowed on before, there was another pretty big and relatively advanced civilization on Tamriel around this point, the Khajiit. Over the course of the Meretic era, the Khajiit of Elsewhere were living in, as we call it, the 16 Kingdoms period. The Khajiit themselves call this period the period of the 16 clans, because it's actually a little bit more complicated than there just being 16 kingdoms. To summarize, during the Meretic era, the Khajiit were split up into 16 clans. Each of these clans had some towns and small cities under their control, which were used as trading hubs between the different clans. These are largely the cities that we see in Elsewhere today, so these were founded during this period. These cities, under the control of the clans, were the main reason why the other peoples of Tamriel would call this the 16 Kingdoms period, as they viewed these 16 clans with their own trading hubs as kingdoms. The Khajiit themselves, however, view it rather differently. Because the Khajiit themselves say that except for those cities, the Khajiiti clans had no claim over territory in the land, and the vast majority of the Khajiit during this point still belonged to the clans living in nomadic ways of life. However, over the course of the different centuries, more and more Khajiit would go to these cities that had been founded. This would lead to the name 16 Kingdoms actually getting some more merit. And we know that by the middle of the First Era, that these 16 kingdoms were loosely ruled by a Khajiit called the Moon Emperor, who ruled the 16 kingdoms. How this emperor was chosen or how he or she came to the position that they held, we don't exactly know, or how their relation with the Main was at the time. However, I personally suspect that the process of getting a new Moon Emperor had something to do with the stance of the moons by the time of the previous Moon Emperor's death. Or maybe even the stance of the moons determined the abdication of the current emperor and would then lead to another emperor being instated. I don't say this just because their name is the Moon Emperor, but because the relations between the 16 kingdoms were also determined by the stances of the moons. You see, we know that during the early clan period, the dominant clan who would represent Elsewhere on the world stage and who had the most influence domestically was determined by the stance of the moons. This would continue into the kingdoms period, where the kingdom correlating with a certain stance of the moon, would have the most influence. Because each clan or kingdom had their own moment in the spotlight at some point, as for example when both moons were full, the kingdom of Anaquina, or the clan of Anaquina, would have been the dominant power over elsewhere, while if they had 2 new moons for example, then the kingdom of Senchal would have the most dominant power. This shifting system of authority over the region actually worked out pretty well for the province's stability during this period, as the Khajiit probably had one of the most peaceful and prosperous civilizations during this period. The fact that there were 16 different entities cooperating made for a pretty complex but also very integrated economy. Each clan or kingdom had roughly their own area where they resided and had their own services and goods that they could provide or could not provide specifically. Every clan was trading with basically all the others, as each clan had something the others needed and that they were willing to trade for things that they needed. For example, we know that Anaquina provided warriors to the kingdom of Torval, which in exchange would provide Anaquina with the bounty of the sea, so for example fish, pearls, seaweed, etc. While we have always been aware of this 16 kingdoms period existing, it's only until now, with the release of the Elder Scrolls Online Elsewhere, that we have gained most of the knowledge that I've presented in this video. Elder Scrolls Online Elsewhere also gave us a book called The 16 Kingdoms, which states the name of each kingdom, their king or queen, and the thing that they are good at. This means that the verses provided in this book must have been written somewhere around the middle to late First Era, as this is the period when the so-called 16 kingdoms became actual kingdoms instead of clans. I will not fully read the book for you, but I will shortly tell you the names of the 16 kingdoms and the service that they provided in Elsewhere's economy. You had Anaquina, which provided warriors, Rimmon, who traded a lot with the outside world, Riverhold, who were farmers, June, which provided priests, Orcrest, of which we don't know exactly what their speciality are. We know that they had a lot of thieves, but I can't really imagine that being a thing that they could trade. You had Verkarth, which presumably provided archers, Mervale, which were artisan brewers, Helcon, which provided cattle, Alabaster, which had the best poets, the kingdom of Brook Ra, which were river traders and traffickers, Corinth, which provided wood and lumber, Pa Alatin, which were the mages, Tenmar, which provided furs, Torval, which brought fish and royal guards for the main, Canarthia, who brought sugar and fish, and finally Senchal, who provided sea trade and apparently also medicine in some form. Something interesting of note here is that Canarthia was most likely the island of Canarthi's Roost, which is more or less a sort of noob island in the Elder Scrolls Online. Of course, each kingdom provided more services and goods than just the things that I've listed here. However, this is what the documentation that we have actually says, because other than that we don't really have any documentation on the period. This extremely integrated economy that they had and the political stability following from it and the cycle of leadership made Elsewhere probably the most stable province on Tamriel for centuries, and in addition to that it made it so that the Khajiit stood strong and united against any invading powers, making it so that Elsewhere has been independent and sovereign since the beginning of the Meridic era until basically the late First Era. As the period of the 16 kingdoms came to an end in the late First Era in the year 2260 of the First Era, when the Thracian plague ravaged Tamriel, causing for a great lowering in Tamriel's population because so many of the individuals living on Tamriel died because of the plague. In this period the Khajiit also suffered terribly, and because of it the province's balance of power was basically more or less gone and has changed radically. Current literature from Elsewhere states that after the plague, many of the still tribal Khajiit migrated to the cities to avoid starvation, and after this mass urbanization that followed out of the fear for starvation, 2 clans took power over all of Elsewhere, Anaquina and Palatine. Literature does not exactly tell us whether this happened by force, or if this happened because the clans simply merged due to the massive population loss around Elsewhere. I personally suspect the latter, that the clans, due to the many losses in population and their decreasing size, simply decided to merge. It doesn't really matter how this situation came to be, because this was the moment in the late First Era which would be the end of Elsewhere unity, as from that moment on the 2 kingdoms would be split on ideology, way of life, and many other things, like for example their geographical factors, and they would try to be more independent from the other. After the starvation had been prevented, most of Anaquina's former tribal communities went back to a tribal way of life, while most tribal communities in Palatine simply remained in the cities and went over to a sedentary lifestyle like most of the other civilizations in Tamriel had. It's said that at least for the first century of its existence, most Khajiit of Anaquina would look at Palatine and only see corruption and bureaucracy, while Palatine would look at Anaquina and only see laziness and barbarians. This basically meant the end of the 16 Kingdoms period, in my opinion one of the more interesting pieces of Khajiit lore, as it was to an extent truly a unique system on Tamriel.
But that system would never return, as Elsewhere would generally remain divided into bigger political units than the 16 smaller kingdoms. Alright, now let's talk about the political situation of Elsewhere and the politics of the Khajiit in the Second Era, when the Khajiit were part of the Altmerry Dominion under Queen Ayrenn. The story begins about 20 years before the Elder Scrolls Online, when Tamriel and Elsewhere in particular were ravaged by the Khanatan flu, one of Tamriel's biggest epidemics.
You see, during the time of Ayrenn's father's reign, the Khanatan flu, one of Tamriel's worst plagues ever, swept across the continent, and the Khajiit were hit particularly hard and long by this plague. Despite the best efforts of Elswere's main, Akuz-Ri, and his political speaker Lord Garrus-Ri, who are essentially the leaders of Elsewhere, the situation looked dire, and no place in Elsewhere didn't have a lot of losses and death. In addition to that, there weren't enough supplies, medicine and healers, so the main and his speaker appealed to the other provinces to help Elsewhere in their hour of need, and the Somerset Isles under Ayrenn's father answered the call by sending a wealth of medicinal supplies, food and hundreds of Altmerry healing masters. This allowed Elsewhere to stall the plague and eventually get completely rid of it. And while they were grateful, most Khajiit were acutely aware that help from the King of Somerset usually meant that they would need to enter into an alliance with him. Well, he never asked for an alliance, but his daughter, Queen Ayrenn, did appeal to Elsewhere to join her forming Altmerry Dominion, and Lord Garrus-Ri, speaker to the Main with the Main's blessing, then decided to aid Ayrenn and signed the Elden Accord, meaning that Elsewhere joined the Dominion. The alliance is pretty much dominated by the Somerset Isles as the prime power among the three with the most influence, leading to Queen Ayrenn becoming the queen of the alliance. Ironically, the people of both sides aren't super happy with the alliance, as the Bosmer of Valenwood and the Khajiit of Elsewhere are both afraid that the Altmer will come to dominate too much and will disregard their needs, while the people of Somerset are actually afraid that the Bosmer and the Khajiit will try to use them for their good. Basically, the thing keeping the alliance together seems to be the goodwill between the leaders, Queen Ayrenn, King Aeron Camoran, and the speaker Lord Garrus-Ri and the Main, as the people of the provinces often need convincing, while the leaders get on pretty well. By the way, it's pretty important to understand the internal workings of Elsewhere at this time, and why it's the Main and his speaker, Lord Garrus-Ri, who signed the accord. You see, the Main is essentially Elsewhere's leader by name, but is more of a spiritual figure, while the speaker of the Main is the true political power. They work together, and in the case of Garrus-Ri and Akuz-Ri, they are lifelong friends, but generally spiritual things are handled by the Main and political things are handled by the speaker of the Main, making the speaker the de facto leader of Elsewhere. In a political sense, although he is generally expected to take a bit of a neutral role, just like the Main, as Elsewhere's internal politics tend to be convoluted and full of strife, but they are representatives of the Khajiiti people as a whole, and in the absence of real authority in the province, it was them, and not the kings and queens of Elsewhere, to sign the Elden Accord, joining the Altmerry Dominion. As Elsewhere itself, or the Elsewhere Confederacy, when we start playing, doesn't really exist anymore, as Elsewhere was utterly devastated by the Khanatan flu. You see, many places in Elsewhere are left without a ruler when the game starts. The north of the province is controlled by Imperial remnants who established themselves during the time of the Longhouse Emperors, when Elsewhere was suffering terribly under the Khanatan flu, because the Longhouse Emperors then capitalized on this weakness by invading the north of the province, with Euraxia Tarn conquering the kingdom of Rimmon, placing an Imperial remnant in the north. Meanwhile, in the south of Elsewhere in Sensual, the opposite happened, as that city, which has been hit so hard by the Khanatan flu that all their rulers had died, had descended into complete lawlessness, which ruled in its streets as people panicked over the flu, and according to some, the city itself faced a threat to its existence, as pirates and drug lords controlled what was left. Some Khajiit in the city then appealed to other provinces for help, just like the Main and his speaker had done. However, instead of the Altmerry Dominion, it was Emperor Varen Aquilarius, then just freshly crowned emperor after ousting the Longhouse Emperor Leovic, who responded to the call for aid by sending an Imperial legion to help restore order. But this wasn't an occupation force like the Longhouse Emperors would have sent, because Varen sent a legion of builders and medics, which helped restore the order in the city. I mean, seriously, shout out to their commander, General Merrick Renmus, who refused to be recalled by Empress Regent Clivia Tharn, as he didn't see her as a legitimate ruler, suspecting her of having had a hand in the murder of the Emperor. Rather, he stayed behind to protect the city of Sensual and continue the rebuilding efforts, only being willing to be recalled to Cyrodiil by a legitimate emperor. And in Sensual, instead of becoming an imperial despot like Eurexia Tharn in Rimmen, this general actually helped identify Khajiit community leaders in the rebuilding city and then set up a city council to rule the city. And from that moment on, when the council started functioning, he actually started answering to them instead of becoming a military dictator himself. So I mean, shout out to this dude, he's a real one. While the Khajiit were very distrusting of the 13th Legion at first when they arrived, by the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, these Imperial soldiers are actually accepted by the Khajiit, and the Khajiit actually lovingly call them the Shields of Sensual. What were we talking about again? Right, elsewhere not existing. Because Rimmen is under an imperial despot, Sensual is an independent state with its defense guaranteed by the Shields of Sensual, and many other kingdoms are still poor, rebuilding themselves, and not really in any state to play at geopolitics. So while they are all nominally part of the Altmerry Dominion, except for Rimmen and Sensual, they mostly need help instead of being able to provide it to anyone. For example, the kingdom of Orcrest is in complete disarray as a new plague grips the city. So yeah, that's why Elswere's kings and queens did not sign the Elden Accord, but it was rather the Main and his speaker who signed the Elden Accord, hoping partly for more assistance for Elsewhere in rebuilding itself. And to be fair, the Altmerry Dominion under Queen Ayrenn does help the province of Elsewhere, as Lord Garrus Rhee, the speaker of the Main, leads the Elsewhere Defense Force, which aims to solve the internal problems of Elsewhere, and that defense force is supplied and aided by the Altmerry Dominion.
Now at some point the Dominion ended up falling apart, with Elsewhere regaining its independence. That is, until eventually it became part of the Septim Empire in the Third Era, only to then regain its independence again for a while after the Oblivion Crisis and the death of Martin Septim, the final Septim Emperor. That independence would last until the year 115 of the Fourth Era, when Elsewhere became part of the Altmerry Dominion in the form of client states. Now that's the situation that we find in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and let's talk about how we got there and about that situation.
Because there is so little information on the other provinces except for Skyrim during the year 201 of the Fourth Era, most that we can do is speculate. But before we can speculate, we need some sort of a basis. So what had happened to Elsewhere in the past few years? To understand that, we need to go back to the year 5 of the Fourth Era, when the Red Year happened in Morrowind, and threw the Empire in even further disarray than it already was. In the years prior, High Chancellor Orcato had been successfully repairing the Empire. But when the Red Year happened, all hope for a quick restoration of order within the Empire vanished. It is in this chaos that both Blackmarsh and Elsewhere ceded from the Empire and became independent. The two kingdoms of Elsewhere, Anaquina and Palatine, decided to form a union, the Elsewhere Confederacy. This confederacy remained a neutral power on Tamriel until the year 98 of the Fourth Era. It is in this year where the two moons of Nirn, Masser and Secunda, vanished for 2 years in what became known as the Void Nights. While everyone on Tamriel was just enjoying their darker nights, the Khajiit were in complete disarray. The moons affected their entire birth patterns. It even influenced the race of Khajiit that a child Khajiit becomes. So, their entire culture, heck, their entire race was in danger now that the moons seemed just to be gone. Then 2 years later, the moons suddenly reappear, and the Thalmor quickly take credit for the reappearance, claiming it was their magic that brought back the moons. This wasn't really like a big deal for the rest of Tamriel, most even doubted that it was the Thalmor, but not the Khajiit. Their entire race was saved when the moons returned, and they immediately needed someone to project their gratitude upon and to have credit for the moons returning. So to the Khajiit, the Thalmor that just claimed, hey, we brought back the moons, they became heroes. In the coming years, the neutral state of the Elsewhere Confederacy would have a huge sway in public opinion, from the neutral to very pro-Thalmor and anti-Empire. It went so far even that in the year 115 of the Fourth Era, the Elsewhere Confederacy Union dissolved, and the two kingdoms of Anaquina and Palatine became client states of the Altmerry Dominion. So, for all of you who don't play strategy games, a client state means that you basically rule yourself, but all your domestic policy is in your hands, domestic laws are yours, food distribution internally, etc, etc. But your hand in foreign policy, you hand to someone else, so your foreign diplomacy is in the hands of someone else. Your relations with other states are determined by the Dominion. Your army, if requested by the Dominion, has to assist them, no matter what the Khajiit themselves think of it. You have no freedom in foreign policy in any way, but inside your own country you are still autonomous. So, knowing that, we can be kind of sure that the Khajiit participated in the Great War. If not in the initial attack, then surely with the reinforcements, after things started to turn black on the Thalmor. So, how they are doing right now, we simply don't know. I mean, there's a reason why I usually don't make these videos about more of the provinces, because we just know so little about it. But what we do know is that the High Elves view the Khajiit, just like the Bosmer, as lesser beings to themselves, to an even greater degree than the Bosmer. And we know that they hold purges in Valenwood, and well, we don't know any of those purges happening in Elsewhere, and there is a good chance that there are none in Elsewhere, because the Khajiit are still autonomously ruled, because they are a client state and not a province of the Dominion. But you can bet that there are probably Thalmor operatives in Elsewhere to root out any rebellion against the pro-Thalmor governments. I do think there is some degree of rebellion in Elsewhere, but to a lesser extent than in Valenwood. Valenwood is completely owned by the Dominion in every way, with a complete puppet government, meaning that all decisions it makes are in favor of the High Elves and the Dominion. Meanwhile, in Elsewhere, there remains some self-governance, which by the Khajiit themselves, at least domestically. And that means that the government will probably make more decisions in favor of its population, even if the foreign policy is completely in the hands of the Dominion. But still, even though Elsewhere are two kingdoms, Anaquina and Palatine, I think that both are essentially now Thalmor puppets. But we really don't know. There might be one of them or even both of them that they have really a lot of autonomy and just have a lot of say in their own foreign policy. We don't know, because we don't know under what sort of treaty rights the two kingdoms aligned with the Dominion. I suppose we maybe find out in Elder Scrolls 6, maybe in a book or anything, but for now this is basically all that we know. I know it's not much.
And that was about all the lore I ever covered on the Khajiit and Elsewhere. And I really hope that you enjoyed this long lore collection. If you made it all the way to the end, why not comment something under this video which has your favorite color as part of the sentence. That way I know you really made it all the way here. And if you make it an especially weird comment, people will be very confused. But I will know that you made it, so, you know, why not do that? And if you enjoyed the video, why also not subscribe to the channel? We're almost to 100,000 subscribers and you really want to be in there before we reach it. Or at least I want you to be in here.
Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon subscribers, Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Athena Iodis, Doji, Fenrir, King Chris, Pavel T, Bentham Gwar, Volkir of Argonia, Leo Worley, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen keep this channel alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.